Turning from arguments in support of psychological egoism to arguments in support of ethical egoism, let's consider the first argument that Rachel offers up that purports to provide good reasons for accepting ethical egoism as a correct normative ethical doctrine. And this first argument, then, Rachel calls the argument that altruism is self-defeating. And the idea here is that, look, if we want to promote everyone's interest, if we want to promote social welfare generally, then the best way to promote them and the best policies to adopt, right, are policies that encourage people to pursue their own interests exclusively and not to try and act in ways that promote other people's interests. And in the longer version of this argument, Rachel talks about why people might argue that way. And the idea that really motivates the second premise in this argument is this idea that, look, when you're acting in ways to try and promote the welfare of other individuals, say you tax people's wages in order to create a general benefit like Social Security that ensures a minimum income for people when they retire, right? Whenever you try and do that, the argument goes, what you end up doing is not promoting general welfare, not accomplishing some altruistic goal. In fact, what you do is undermine your ability to accomplish general welfare or to accomplish promoting everyone's interests. And there are a number of different ways people argue this, right? One way to argue it is that these programs don't actually end up benefiting everybody, that they actually end up undermining people's happiness and overall welfare and financial security and so on. Another way of arguing for them is that they're meddlesome and interfering and that they undermine people's own independence and ability to accomplish things themselves. And so in doing so, they actively undermine people's ability to promote their own interests, to become happy, to become financially successful. They undermine their independence, and hence they result in net negative social results. So this argument then says, look, we ought to act in ways that promote everyone's interests. But the best policies, the best way to promote everyone's interests is actually to enact policies that encourage people to pursue their own interests exclusively and not to try and promote the interests of others. And therefore, the policies that we should pursue, the rules that we should use to regulate our ethical behaviors are in fact ethical egoism, are in fact that we should always try and promote our own self-interest exclusively. So there's the argument, the motivations for the premises in the argument. What's Rachel's criticism of this argument? Well, Rachel criticizes this argument because he says, look, the first assumption of this argument is inconsistent with its conclusion. The conclusion is ethical egoism, that we should act in ways that promote our own self-interest exclusively. But, right, our assumption is that the morally right thing to do is to act in ways that promote everyone's interests generally. And that's an assumption about what makes actions morally good, about what is an ethically praiseworthy motivation for actions. That violates ethical egoism. Ethical egoism claims that you can't have morally praiseworthy actions. You can't have morally good motivations that don't exclusively pursue one's own interests. And that's exactly the sort of motivation that's being endorsed in that first premise. And so Rachel suggests that this argument, the argument that altruism is self-defeating, is in fact internally inconsistent, that the premise is inconsistent with the conclusion. And so we can't argue that the conclusion is true based on the truth of the premises, because if the conclusion is true, the premise can't be true. And if the premise is true, the conclusion can't be true. And so Rachel argues that this is a bad argument. We might also argue that the second premise here looks likely to be false. That is, these claims that the best policies to promote social welfare overall, to promote uh, overall happiness and financial security, are always going to be policies that encourage people to exclusively pursue their own selfish interests. That kind of claim looks likely to be empirically false. So if we look at examples of policies like that in the United States or in Europe, in industrialized countries generally. So we look at programs like Social Security, or we look at socialized medicine, say in Canada and England and Germany, and really every other industrialized country besides the United States. And what we see is that these policies are exactly the sort of policies that the second premise says won't work. They're policies where we tax people who are working in the case of Social Security in order to get money to provide a basic income to people who are retired. Right? So these are policies that actually encode not pursuing your own interests exclusively in order to benefit society as a whole. And people seem to be pretty satisfied with Social Security. And in fact, if Social Security didn't exist, one of the things that we know is that something like 35 to 40% of Americans have less than $1,000 in their 401k. So these people aren't adequately preparing for retirement. They aren't going to be able to have a living income if they retire. So either they're going to have to work for the rest of their life or they're going to suffer extreme poverty. Moreover, right, they don't have a sufficient preparation in case they get serious debilitating injuries. Social Security also does that. Right? And so it looks like Social Security performs this useful function of ensuring a minimum income for retirement and disability that isn't being fulfilled just by people pursuing their own interests. And we find similar results when we look at socialized medicine, where the government steps in, it taxes people in order to fund a general medical infrastructure and ensure every individual universally. What we find is that in countries like that, they have a higher quality of care than the United States does, and they pay less for it. Right? So our capitalist, pursue our own interest approach to healthcare actually results in us as a nation spending more money on healthcare and having worse outcomes on healthcare than, say, Canada or Germany or England. And so it's not at all obvious that that second premise is true, that the best way to promote general welfare is by enacting policies that allow people to exclusively pursue their own interests.